1978 was a pivotal year in comic books. So let's take a look at some of the events that happened in 1978 that really shaped the industry, as well as talk about some of the comic books that came out during that year. 1978 was a year that DC Comics had a collapse of sorts, to the point that they almost canceled one of their longest running and historic titles, which is Detective Comics. Can you imagine that? DC was going to cancel the comic book series that they were named after. After all, DC actually stands for Detective Comics. What makes this even more strange was that Detective at this time was going through a renaissance of sorts. This was a superb run by Steve Englehart, Marshall Rogers, and Terry Austin, one of the high points of comic books in the 1970s. I'm glad that cooler heads prevailed, and what ended up happening was that they ended up folding Batman Family into Detective Comics. So why was DC in so much trouble? Well, let's take a look at the history of comic book publishing just to give you a little bit more context. For decades, comic book publishers made most of their money through newsstands and similar retail outlets. It was a pretty simple process. Publishers produced comic books, printers manufactured them and sent them to distributors, and distributors would send them to the newsstands or retailers for sale. Any unsold comic books would be returned or reported unsold to the publisher. Retailers and distributors would take a percentage of the sales, and publishers would get the remainder. Now, this system worked fine for decades, like from the 1940s to the late 1960s. As we went into the 1970s, we started to see a change. For one thing, the number of newsstands and retailers for comic books started to shrink. And compounding this was the return rate for a lot of comic books were getting worse. A lot of these retail outlets became less accessible for kids, and comic book specialty stores, while they existed, only made a tiny portion of overall sales. So for a comic book to be successful, sales of 50% or higher of what was printed was considered good. I've read on more than one occasion that the break-even point for the big publishers was about 1/3 of sales of what they printed in the 1970s. Based on that, if we do some math, we can figure out a rough estimate on how much it costs to produce a comic book. So let's say you have a comic book like Batman in 1978. The average monthly copies printed was about 375,000. And they actually sold about 1/3 of the copies they printed, or 125,000 copies. The average cover price for that year was 40 cents, so the total sales is $49,500. Approximately half of that money would go to the retailer and distributor, and the other half goes back to the publisher. So, in the simplest terms, and take these numbers with a grain of salt, back in 1978, it would cost approximately $25,000 for a major publisher like DC to produce and print a monthly comic book with a print run of 375,000 copies. The print sold numbers I'm using here are from Comic-Con, which is a great website with tons of information about comic book sales in the past. Now, take a better selling title like Superman in 1978. Superman had a print run of about 600,000 copies and sold an average of 37%. And let's say it costs an additional $5,000 or so to print those extra copies. Superman would still net over $14,000 a month, which is pretty good. If we go back further years with Superman, you would see some pretty incredible sales figures for that title. Like, not only did they print more copies of Superman, but they also sold a lot more, as high as 75% in some years. Like, Superman really was making DC rich. These numbers would start to drop and continue to drop throughout the 1970s. Superman was still making DC money, but Superman wasn't the problem. It was the other titles. DC in the 1970s published a lot of titles, and let's do a quick flyby of some of the titles that they published. So Batman Family was canceled in 78, but they were actually going to keep that title and cancel Detective instead, but they folded Batman Family into Detective. And the last few issues of Batman Family have some really nice covers by Mike Kaluta. This is an issue of Battle Classics #1, mostly reprints. It only lasted the one issue. Beowulf #1. DC really tried to make some Conan clones. This didn't last very long. Black Lightning #1, which is also his first appearance, and Black Lightning would have an issue featured in canceled comic Cavalcade, along with Claw the Unconquered #1, which I think is one of the better titles that ended up getting canceled in terms of like quality of story. But the scheduling of Claw, I think, was extremely erratic. One of the titles that actually came out in 78 that would have a longer run is DC Comics Presents. And this is kind of like the DC, this is the Superman team-up series where he would be teamed up with another hero in the DC universe. DC Superstars had a kind of a rotating lineup. They were mostly all reprints. Doorway to Nightmare, despite having amazing covers by Mike Kaluta, well, the stories inside were not really that great. This is an issue of Dynamite Classics with a great cover, but it only lasted the one issue. Again, more reprints, and I believe it has the Simonson Manhunter reprint stories as well, too. Firestorm, the Nuclear Man. This is his first appearance, and would not last very long, would also be part of the canceled comic Cavalcade. This is Freedom Fighters #1, a series that ended up having legs. It actually had a pretty good run, and I think partly due to the characters that were revived from the Golden Age. The comic books themselves weren't necessarily really that great, but an interesting title. This is Shade the Changing Man #1, Steve Ditko's creation, and one of the better titles, I believe, to come out of the 1970s in DC. But, unfortunately, didn't get as much positive response from, comic book fans as you would have hoped, despite it being, pretty good, I would say. And I think it's certainly one of the titles worth searching out for or worth checking out from that period, from 1978. And this is a copy of Showcase #100. Now, this is not the last issue, but it's close to the last issue. And kind of surprising that a title like Showcase would have been canceled, because it's, the title where you do experimentation, where you bring back new characters or introduce new ones. So it seemed like why would you cancel a title like that, like a tryout series, given the historical success of Showcase before as well, too. Star Hunters #1, science fiction. Science fiction was generally a difficult genre to sell for any publisher. Steel #1, also the first appearance, and I'm going to say, not the greatest comic book in the world. This is Super Team Family #1, and reprints. And, I think DC tried a bit too much, or did a bit too much with regards to putting reprints on the stands. Teen Titans #44, which is a reboot of the original series, and they just continued with the numbering. So this is the first issue back. They're back at last, and unfortunately it wouldn't last. And the last one I wanted to show was The Warlord. And Warlord was actually one of the better selling titles for DC that survived the DC Implosion. And even as far into as the late 70s, early 80s, it was a top 3 title for DC, outselling titles like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. I think what you saw as, time shifted, instead of comic book fans being character driven, they started to become more driven to comic books with better writers and artists. And Warlord is a perfect example of this. What the big publishers will do is bring out new titles, and hopefully they'll have a hit. The problem is they won't get complete sales information until a few months after a title has been out for sale. Some of the sell rates for these new titles were bad. I mean, really bad. Remember when I said the break-even point is about 1/3 or 33%? Well, some of these titles had sales well below 20%, some even below 10%. The sales of popular titles like Superman were used to support new titles in the hopes that they would succeed. But on the most part, in the 1970s, these new titles failed. So why did this happen? Like a few things. Well, people started to read less in general. Television became a bigger part of everyone's lives, and there was a lot more competition in terms of entertainment. There were also other factors in play, making it a perfect storm for comic book sales. And when I said storm of events, I also meant literally, because the severe winters in 1977 and 1978 caused all kinds of problems for comic book sales. DC also did something very interesting in 1978, and that early in the year, they did what was called a DC Explosion. They actually introduced a lot of titles, as well as increased the cover price on their comic books. Like, what they were hoping to do here was that they wanted to kind of push out the competition from the newsstands. But what this ended up doing was this ended up like backfiring on them pretty badly. So in the second half of the year, what happened was called what some people refer to as the DC Implosion. While many people have speculated over the years as to why things turned out at DC the way they did, Paul Levitz, who had a higher level position at DC at that time, simply said, the market sucked. It's as simple as that. Bad market conditions compounded by other costly factors hit the industry hard. In August of 1978, DC started to cancel all kinds of titles. Aquaman, Claw the Unconquered, Mr. Miracle, and Shay the Changing Man, followed by All-Star Comics, Battle Classics, Black Lightning, Doorway to Nightmare, and many others. More titles would follow suit in October. And one really interesting collector's item that came out of this is Canceled Comic Cavalcade, an in-house comic book published by DC that had all the stories that were going to be published but ended up being canceled. It's a truly rare item with only 35 copies printed, and they were just all kept in-house. Copies were given to anyone who was kind of related to creating the content, as well as one copy was sent to Robert Overstreet, who was the fellow who published the comic book price guide at that time, just to kind of say that this actually happened, this kind of the collapse. But we printed all these books just so that we have copyright. So how did Marvel do in 1978? Well, one of the big things that happened at Marvel in 1978 was that they promoted Jim Shooter to become editor-in-chief. I think the irony in this is that Jim Shooter actually worked for DC for a number of years before coming to Marvel. And he gained a lot of valuable experience there. And he brought that experience or his knowledge of the industry to Marvel and brought this kind of level of discipline or rigor that Marvel really needed at that time. He was the right person for the right job, the right time. Marvel also had some talent that was really starting to kick it into high gear in 1978, most notably John Byrne. John Byrne would become the regular artist for X-Men, and as you well know, X-Men would become one of Marvel's biggest titles of all time. It's not to say there weren't any good comic books that came out in 1978, and there were plenty of them. I've already mentioned the Englehart-Rogers-Austin detective run. DC also published a very memorable limited collector's edition, Superman vs. Muhammad Ali. Marvel published the Korvac saga, written by Jim Shooter, that had a number of different artists, in particular George Perez, and it was a spectacular story. I also wanted to talk about the Eagle Awards, and these are English or British awards that were presented every year at a comic book convention in England, and it's a good indicator of what was popular in comic books at that time. So in 1979, they would publish the award winners for 1978. So I thought I would quickly go over these awards because it's kind of interesting to see who was popular or what was popular in comic books at that time, specifically in the American market. So the favorite comic book artist was John Byrne, and the other people in contention were Marshall Rogers, George Perez, Michael Golden, and Gene Colan. The favorite comic book writer, Chris Claremont, and John Byrne and Chris Claremont were doing X-Men at this time. Other writers nominated were Steve Englehart, Roy Thomas, Steve Gerber, and Doug Mensch. Favorite inker, Terry Austin. No surprise, these are all X-Men related. Other inkers of note, Tom Palmer, Bob Layton, Klaus Janson, and Joe Sinnott. Favorite comic book magazine, X-Men. Others were The Avengers, Detective Comics, The Tomb of Dracula, and Jonah Hex. Favorite comic book character, Batman. The runners-up were Wolverine, Howard the Duck, Conan, Spider-Man, and Doctor Strange. Favorite comic book group, the X-Men, with the runners-up being the Avengers, Fantastic Four, Defenders, and the Legion of Superheroes. Favorite comic book villain, Magneto was the favorite, and the runners-up were the Joker, Doctor Doom, Michael Korvac, Dr. Bong, and Deathstalker. I had to actually look up Dr. Bong. I've read some Howard the comic books, but I wasn't familiar with this super villain, but just hilarious. The favorite supporting character was Wolverine, with the runners-up being Beast, Vision, Nightcrawler, Beverly, Switzler, and Hawkeye. Character most worthy of their own feature, the Silver Surfer, with runners-up Warlock, Jack of Hearts, Killraven, and Deathlock. The favorite single stories were X-Men 111, and the runners-up were the Avengers 178, Superman vs. Muhammad Ali, the Avengers 177, and X-Men number 109. Now, the Avengers 177 really is like the final issue of the Korvac saga. I don't really think it should have been part of the favorite single story category. The best continued story, the Avengers 167 to 177. That's the Korvac saga. The runners-up were X-Men 114 to 116. Captain Marvel 58 to 62, which kind of surprised me, but also made me happy because I like that storyline written by Doug Mensch and Pratt, with artwork by Pat Broderick. Detective 475, 476, Engelhard Rogers. Thor 272 to 278 by Roy Thomas and John Buscema. And another X-Men run 111 to 113. The favorite covers for 1978. Master of Kung Fu number 67-1 by Paul Gulacy. Detective 476, and a trio of X-Men covers, 111, 113, and 114. So, as you can see, the Eagle Awards were just dominated by Marvel titles. I want to say that 90% of all the winners and the runners-up were Marvel. So Marvel was starting its upward march in terms of market dominance, and this would be led by, of course, by X-Men. This video is a bit of a departure for me as I talked a little bit more about the comic book industry. Well, a lot more about the comic book industry as well as its history. For me, I find the comic book history or the comic book industry history to be very interesting, especially, considering all the ups and downs it's had over the years. And 1978 was a very interesting year for the comic book industry because you had, the DC Implosion. You had what people thought was maybe the end of the comic book industry, and somehow it survived. And, if you look historically, the comic book industry has definitely had these kind of peaks and valleys, from the 50s during the Senate investigations, even to like the 90s crash when you had, the kind of like the speculation bubble. So it certainly had a lot of interesting moments. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I know it's a bit different, but I thought I would, take a deeper dive into some information about the comic book industry. So if you enjoyed this video, you can check out another one of my videos over here or here. Until next time, read and enjoy your comic books.